Okay, let's get started. Welcome back to LMAC Live. This is episode 3 on states. The topic tonight is a look at an introduction to states and the definition of and how we can define the parameters around states being created in a new constitutional government. The idea of the way we treat states, I mean we as in America, is a little bit different than how states have how we America originally considered states. I'm going to take a cursory look at that. We'll touch on that more later, but then I want to get into the idea of what the purpose of subnational government organizational units are, the purposes are. So, for example, let's get some context. So, the way we're approaching making a country is we're going to use this idea of having a constitution. A constitution is a document or set of documents that defines what constitutes us as a national or corporate identity. Corporate in the sense of collective. Constitutions are relatively new, sort of, in treating them as a document that can be addressed explicitly and can be checked to see if what we're doing makes sense according to some written textual content. Really, there have been constitutions throughout history. It's just that the things that would be considered the constitutional document in many ancient places, kingdoms, city-states, and so forth, were a mixture of common laws, cultural norms, and often explicit laws that were created. And sometimes those were subject, well, very often those were subject to the discretion of ruling powers and authorities. So those could be kings or, various sorts of organizations of senators and so forth. Congress of various kinds. Tonight's overview is going to be broad, like I said. It's going to be a gloss of the topic, and there's a lot of different things to talk about for this. But what I want to do is, over the next several episodes, start making a rough sketch of what it would look like to define a constitution, what the elements of that constitution needs to be, what's the relationship between the longevity of states, the prosperity of different states. Sorry, I'm using states here to mean the classic sense of nations or countries. The longevity of such states as that relates to the length of constitution, as it relates to the the size of the country, the time in which it existed, so peacetime, wartime, etc. I've got a bunch of data that I've accumulated on that, and we'll take a look at those later. But for our purposes tonight, a gloss. So let's go ahead and address first the idea of setting constitutional limits on states. The United States does this in some ways. We parameterize elements of statecraft, and we do it in terms of setting limits on, actually, the United States Constitution specifically gives to states and people every power not enumerated for the federal government, for the federation of states. And then there are specific powers given to states, and then others that are reserved without being explicitly named. What we want to do here is talk about a different kind of limitations. We specifically want to talk about, in this case, tonight we're going to be talking about size. And when I say size here, I mean geographic size, although we'll touch lightly on other kinds of size, like population and things like that. I was checking my audio meter to see if I could, if the mic was picking up a sound I'm hearing in the room. I don't think it is. Okay, so the reason we want to talk about size, I'm going to approach this from a common sense direction first. Keeping in mind that the first rule of polity is that people will pervert everything. We need to understand that it is possible to limit, or rather to inhibit, people's ability to pervert things in some ways. That can be done through policy. It can be done through constitutional bounds, right? So the classic form of political shape manipulation that we are all familiar with is the idea of gerrymandering. The idea there is that in the defining of political boundaries, you define or redefine a district for voting or something like that, economic district, in order to optimize for some particular end that is especially not necessarily in the best interest of the people. Now, before I want to, there's a digression I'm going to have to make here about how people pervert things. The most important way that someone can pervert something is with motivated reasoning. I want something, so I change my reasoning to accommodate getting the end I want. This is ubiquitous and is extraordinarily treacherous. And one of the really terrible things about this is somebody who's really good at this can deceive themselves into believing that they're not doing it. So let's say you're gerrymandering for the sake of gaining political votes so that you can, not gaining political votes, winning an election so that you can effect some, say, racist policy, as an example, Jim Crow sorts of things. One would argue that, one could reasonably argue in such a case that that is not for the good of the people, because if you hadn't done the gerrymandering, then the vote wouldn't have gone the way you wanted, and therefore the will of the people is not to have that racist set of laws. Someone will deceive themselves into believing that what they're doing is for the good of the people, typically by using the notion that I know better than the people what's good for the people. The tricky part about this is that's usually the human condition. People are so motivated and pervert their own lives so much as often to completely subvert their long-term and overall health for short-term gain. You have things like lotteries, and you have things like people not saving for rainy day funds or retirement or so forth. But there's a bigger question. Should people be allowed to cause themselves to suffer in those ways? That's something we'll get into in another topic. The short answer, spoiler, is yes, but it's good for a place to put boundaries on what they're allowed to do. But also, just on a more in a more concrete way, the zeitgeist of a given place could be pro some sort of racist policy, and so a people can vote terrible things on purpose into existence. What we want to try to do is, one, remember that the first rule of polity is that people will pervert everything. I'm going to say that so you're sick of hearing it. But what we want to do is not to prevent people from perverting everything. That's not possible. Instead, what we want to do is to provide constraints that make it disincentivize people to pervert things in general, and incentivize, but they will, right? So we want to incentivize them through the structure of governance, light-handedly. We want to incentivize them to pervert relatively unimportant things, right? To put their attention to those things. That'll be things like, engaging in activities that might not be an excellent use of human effort, maybe some kinds of pleasure seeking and such, but that aren't destructive to themselves or others. That said, what we don't want to do is come in with a strong assumption about what is and isn't a valid thing to do there. We want to create structures that allow people to go through the evolutions of their own selves, of their families, of their communities, and of their larger regions, without giving them so much power that they can be extraordinarily damaging to others. Okay, so we are going to talk about one aspect of defining a state, and that is going to be a size, the size of the state. Now, America, just as an example, has a vast amount of counties, of what I'm going to call subnational governmental organizations, governmental units. We call those pretty much counties. They're Louisiana uses parishes, and Alaska does some different stuff. Different places do different things. But in the original conception of America, we said, hey, we've got these states like the state of France or the state of England or the state of, whatever. And those states are organized into coalitions or federations of various kinds. One of those being, for example, Great Britain, which has England, Scotland, Wales, and the whole Irish thing. We saw that there's great utility in having the ability to have open borders between states and some other things, but I'll leave it there for now. And so we created this idea, we America, right? Created this idea. You know what? Maybe a better way to say that would be Europeans who came to a new place created this idea of filling this land with states and then putting them into a federation that had open borders between them and a high level of trust, but also protections to help make sure that the federation doesn't split. You don't want things like, Vermont going to war with Maine or whatever. So we created a constitution that helped us with that. The original one, of course, was the Articles of the Confederation. Confederation means federated together, confederation of states. That lasted for about a decade, but we decided that for various reasons, it was not good enough. It wasn't sufficient. And one of the principal drivers of it was that the Articles of the Confederation didn't have a strong enough federal presence to tie in and to tie the different states into each other and create unity. Another example of this kind of federation is the European Union. They, of course, are a union of the European states, the state of, Denmark and whatever, coming together to have, in their case, a unified currency like we do, and open trade and different kinds of abilities to move around. Now, that's all well and good. So, and that's actually a really good thing. One of the things we haven't talked about for a little while, one of the things I haven't talked about yet is there are other notions of polity than the first rule. And among those are things that could reasonably be considered something like philosophical foundations for governance. And really philosophical foundations for life. Those are sometimes called things like human rights. I think that is a problematic, perhaps dangerous framing of those things. I'll tell you some ways later that I prefer to talk about them. I'm open to hear from other people too on this topic. But I like to think of it as principles of just human life and flourishing. One of those, actually, I'll say three of them right now. They're very, very important. The ownership of property. That's, I think that is the fundamental right, where property has a looser definition than the matter, this way, than a piece of matter. A lot of things that are civil challenges for us come from the idea of ownership of property, including things like the notion of intellectual property. Freedom of speech is greatly simplified, for example, when we start thinking in terms of speech that articulates some intellectual property, my ideas, versus speech that takes various kinds of actions like exhortations. Let's do this is not the same as me having a notion that I propound to others. So ownership of property is a really fundamental one. Freedom of association is another really important one. The government should not be able to restrict people from associating in general. There are, nuances around crime and such. But in general, if two people want to associate, the government should not be restricting them from associating. Again, crime like conspiracies obviously need to be taken into account. And then there is also another important one, which is a necessary parallel to the freedom to associate, which is the freedom to dissociate, such that people who do not want to be in certain kinds of relationship to each other don't have to. Now, these three taken together, I'm not going to go into the details of it right at this moment, but these three taken together help us to understand that of the two major governance styles, which is having a unitary government, a unified single large government force, that would be something like a monarchy with a single monolithic government that rules over everything, is less favorable for human flourishing than a federation of subnational governments, right? So we want to talk about states here as as a way of creating a framework for people to associate and dissociate, to have property ownership and the transmission of property to children, heirs, whatever, or to for economic reasons and so forth. We want to talk about states in terms of being able to produce those. Now, one of the great human perversions is the lust for power. That's going to be, in general, that is going to be something that we're going to need to be militating against most of the time in our talk about constitutional structure. We don't need to go into it for the moment, but generally speaking, lust for power is a way for people to gain control, typically because they're either avaricious or fearful or appetitive in some way. They've got appetites consuming them, so they need power in order to execute those appetites. That Saddam Hussein and his children and such were a great example of that. They had power, absolute power over their nation, and they used it to do horrible things to the population at their whim. Kim Jong-un and and so forth are another example of that. They are disturbingly exploitative. There have been others throughout history, Caligula, Nero, other people. So what we want to do is we want to create a structure in which we can define places where people can live, but also where they can meaningfully associate and meaningfully dissociate. And the mechanism that we want to provide for association and dissociation is culture. We want to allow for people of a common kind and ilk to come together, live together in a culture. And we also want people to have the ability to say, you know, I don't like this culture, and my options are either to, one, change it, right, affect it in some way. If it's something that I think should be changed, again, that would be removing harmful things, like trying to encourage people to vote for whatever. I think, you know, we should, whatever the person thinks is important, desegregate things, protect the water, the waterways, whatever. But also for some things, we want them to be able to say, you know, I just don't personally like this. Like, this is not a thing that I feel compelled to try to change. That could be somebody who has a different opinion about the ways waterways should be managed. We want them to be able to go somewhere else, to a place that has a different ethic, right? A different way. So a mechanism for that is making sure that we can create states. Generally speaking, having a smaller plurality of states, so having 2 states, is going to give a little bit of option for that. Having 20 states is going to give a lot more option for that. And then at some point, there is like an actual geographic restriction. Like, imagine having an island the size of Jamaica and trying to split it into 10,000 different, you know, subnational governments, counties, or whatever. Doesn't make sense. You know, it's just impracticable. There is too much dissociation there. Okay, so what I've done is I have taken a look at a survey of the sizes of states around the world and through history. Let's take a look at that. So this chart is a look at subnational government land, land size in square miles. I know, kilometers, I get it. I don't really care. The relative values are all that matter here. So we're going to look at those. The big deal here is that the overall average subnational government size by land mass is right around 2,500 square miles. And it turns out that this is nearly ubiquitous. You will see that there are places in the Middle East, Australia, Central Asia. You can see these really big spikes, but getting rid of those 5 in this case, really big ones, you get most of them hovering right around the 2,000-ish square miles size. That's true of American counties, so the counties of various states, and I'm including parishes and so forth in that. It's true of all of the different regions and prefectures and provinces and parishes in different regions. You can see here I've broken it out by region. East Asia, South America. I'm going to skip these really big ones. I did Australia all as one, and I'll talk about that, why about that in a minute. And then Central Asia, you got Southeast Asia, South Asia, East Africa, West Africa, Eastern Europe. So one of the things we want to look at is, one, I don't have this information to display right now, but the vast majority of when I'm going to refer to them right now as counties. The vast majority of counties hover in that 1,000 to 3,000 square mile range. Obviously, some places like the Caribbean are going to have smaller ones because it's an island that's small. So what's going on with these really big ones? This is actually, these really large ones are actually generally where the population density is super low. That's a really, really interesting point. Now, the correlation is not super strong of population density to size. It's about a 0.6, but it's a 0.56, something right around there. Actually, I'll just show you that real quickly. But it is a good, strong correlation and something that's worth, thinking about. Okay, I'll just go here. What I did for this, again, this is just a very glossy survey, is I did a Pearson correlation between a bunch of different indices of different factors to land size of subnational or regional governments. We've got a couple of different things here that you can see. Just to give you orient you to this, this dotted green line is a 0.7 correlation, which would be considered a strong, consistent correlation. None of them hit that. None of these factors are very high that way. But the red line is a negative correlation, and the blue line, a blue line that you see is a positive correlation. What that means here is that, let's look at economic activity. Economic activity has a weak positive correlation, and what that means is there's a little bit of a relationship, very, very small, tiny relationship between the size of a county and its economic activity by region that way. What that means is when we're thinking about, hey, we're trying to promote human flourishing, right? We don't need to try to say, if we're trying to promote economic activity, the thing to do there is not to make big counties. There's some other way that's gonna promote economic activity, but it's not correlated strongly to county size. Urbanization has a little bit stronger, and what that means is the more urbanized it is, there's a little bit of a tendency to be larger counties tend to have a little bit more urban population, but it's pretty weak still. Again, we're way off of strong over here, and even in the like 5 to 6 range would be considered moderate, and not super strong. Up here in the 8 or 9 range this is a very strong correlation. Latitude, not super strong either. There's a number of reasons for that, but in my opinion, it has to do with this population density. I haven't done a thorough analysis of that, but typically latitude is somewhat correlated to population density. There are other factors, such as, for example, the Sahara and sub-Saharan areas of Africa are very difficult to live in, very, very low population density, but they're not high latitude. However, the North Pole, the South Pole, the latitude there is extreme, so it's not as many people live there. You have like the Inuit, but not a whole lot of other people. And I'm going to skip these acronyms for right now, but we look at our resource index. This is how many natural resources the place has, the county has, and it's average for a region, right? It's getting stronger, but not super strong. And then what we see here at the top is we have these blue lines, these positive correlations that are growing. They grow from about 0.4, which is still very weak, to about 0.6, which is moderate, but probably there are other more significant factors. Our two highest here are population density, and then these two, the happiness index, which is how it's a particular measurement. I think that one's through the UN I have the sources I can bring up some other time, of the prosperity. All of these, the SPI, happiness index, GNH, HDI, and GPI are prosperity indices. They are designed to help us understand how prosperous a place is. One of the things you'll notice, they probably measure very similar things. One of the things you'll notice is that the GPI, which we're not going to talk about these right now, is negatively correlated to size. So this measure of prosperity is that the smaller the place is, the more prosperous in this way. But these others are positively correlated, and not strongly, but moderately. Noting that these all are approximately measuring the same thing, these can be combined into a single metric that hovers right around, on the positive side, right around 0.5. And what you're seeing here is they're specializing in different kinds of things. That's why one is stronger than another, but they're all about in the same range. You can see 0.43 up to 0.6, so we'll call it a 0.5 about. And then, of course, we've got this population density, which is an inverse correlation. So the more sparsely populated, the bigger the county. That makes sense to us. What's the takeaway from this chart? Okay. This chart does not have anything really strongly that says, look, if you're trying to optimize for prosperity of this kind or that kind, you should definitely make in these cases, a bigger county, or in this case of GPI, a smaller county. We don't have a very strong indicator. Likely what's happening with a correlation of about 0.4 or 0.6, there's a couple of things that could be happening. One is the Pearson correlation value that I've done here is linear. There could be a non-linear size. We may want to do some kind of regression and then see if there's a maximum or minimum in some kind of curve. Let's ignore that for the moment. But basically, there's not a very strong correlation. Probably what's happening with all of these is that there are other factors that are playing into prosperity that aren't really strongly associated with size. So, given that none of these are very clearly influenceable by a strong or by a large or small county size or subnational government size, that means that we get to, in the definition of our, let me go back here, in setting constitutional limits on our states, we get to optimize for other factors unconstrained by whether or not we'll be damaging these factors by and large. For example, we can set factors on size and it's pretty much not going to impact the economic activity. We can set factors on, boundaries on size. It's pretty much not going to affect whether people will tend to live in an urban or suburban or rural way. Obviously, we're not going to specifically affect latitude because definitional. And resources also not something we can affect, although latitude and resources we could, if we wanted to, make those relevant factors, like, for example, the greater some measure of resources, the greater the size of the county. I think that's a bad idea. I'm just saying we could. One of the things we do notice, though, is that there actually is something of a correlation to population density. That makes good common sense. That's to be expected. It means that basically when you have lots and lots of people crammed into a space, counties tend to be smaller and tighter. And when you have not very many people in a space, you have only a very few people crammed into a very large space. Just kidding. You have larger counties. That actually tells us something a little different. And I should say, by the way, this is over a fairly long period of history. I went back to the amount we could, 1,000 years or so. And what we're finding is that it's not absolute. There are other factors involved, but basically humans are tending to prefer a certain size of, let's call it fraternity in citizenship. And we see that in America. It makes sense to you, right? Like, here's an example. Many years ago, I don't think this is the case anymore, when laws were first being passed about federal assistance for disasters. One of the interesting things that happened was that places like Mississippi got a lot of flood relief, but the law was set up such that places like Arizona also got the same amount of flood relief, adjusted for whatever it needed to be adjusted for, but not really adjusted for the fact that the Mississippi has the mighty Mississippi River and Arizona has a bunch of desert. So that's been corrected over time in different ways. But what happens is when you get somebody very far away from you making decisions for you about how you can live your life, that ends up having a deleterious effect. I'm just going to make a wild claim here. It ends up having a deleterious effect on the flourishing of the people. As a matter of fact, one of the really big prominent examples of that is America, right? People living in Spain were making decisions about how the people in the flower of Spain, La Florida, would live. People living in France were making decisions about how the people in Louisiana would live. People living in England were making, the Great Britain, I should say, were making decisions about how the British colonies would live. And of course, obviously, for those empires, nobody. No, that's not true. I'll say it this way. We resented that. We, America, the colonies, in our idea of no taxation without representation, could feel, and we had in our zeitgeist the idea that those who are constraining the manners of our lives did not have sympathy with the manners of our lives. So they weren't, we didn't have a voice to be able to say, I see how this could make sense from a British perspective, here living on this island, whatever, but it doesn't make sense from the perspective of a West Virginian who has a very different set of parameters around their life, the terrain, the resources, the level of development, and so forth. This has been true throughout history, right? When you have something like the British Empire or the Roman Empire, the French Empire, the current American Empire, it is extraordinarily difficult to tailor the constraints you put around a group of people to the considerations that those people have for their own lives in a way that makes them not want to get angry and rebel and revolt. So you see that happening in lots of places. North Carolina, I live in North Carolina. The capital of North Carolina is Raleigh. They're fine. Raleigh does a decent job doing whatever it does. But Raleigh has the ability to dictate elements of how the people in Appalachia live. That's weird. The people in Appalachia have a vote on how the coastal peoples live. The people in Northern California, who, by the way, actively try to break off and make a new state, are frustrated by the density of people in Southern California having such control over how they live up there in Northern California, and so forth. Not just in the United States, but in many places over time. It's, I think, obvious for this. So when we're considering setting limits on states, one of our principal goals is going to be to have small states that are small subnational government, what is the equivalent of a United States state. And we want them to be the size of about a county. 2,500 square miles, ballpark, right? That's 50 miles by 50 miles square, let's say. I'm not suggesting that right now as a hard limit. I am saying, and there would be reasons, by the way, for some to be larger and smaller than that. That's okay. But what we want to do is make it increasingly difficult to deviate from some center line. If there are good reasons, fine. But by and large, we want to tend towards having something that's not too small. Too small would be, 3 families in a 40-acre place having their own government, and then having some kind of weird tyranny or something. I am open to that as a possibility. I'm just saying, generally speaking. But we also want to make sure that we don't have these massive, sprawling subnational government regions like Texas or... I'm from Texas. I have nothing against Texas. It's just, it was not picked because of some notion of human flourishing. We'll do another episode another time on how we actually got our state sizes. You know what? I'll do that in the next episode. How we got our state sizes. But basically, the long and short of it is that people just grabbed for power. They grabbed for resource, and by historical accident, we have a bunch of places like North Carolina, which is named after Caroline, right? There were land grants from people who had a lot of power to people they were granting favors to, and some other factors. And so we're going to, there's a spider right in front of me. So we're going to want to stay away from that. And what we want to do instead is create a set of limits through articles in our Constitution that are simple, easy to understand, easy to check against, right? Not burdensome as far as having difficult to interact with or understand parameters, and that steer us towards a group of people who physically live together. So me, my neighbor, the next town over, a few towns over, we share a common geography, we share a common weather, we share a common usually temperament, and a common way of doing things when our descendants marry, and when we celebrate elements of life, harvesting or whatever. And what we want to do is allow people to have a strong localization, so that there can be a lot of variation and proliferation of variation, so that there are a lot of options for people to live in good ways. Okay. So my overall hypothesis is, just to say explicitly, is that having a lot meaning could mean only 10, right? But having a multitude of smaller regions in the historical human average range of about 2 to, let's call it 1,500 to 4,500 square miles, is going to, it's going to maximize human flourishing in some ways. This will be tested. We'll go through, well, it'll be tested. It'll be tested when we do it, but we'll do some thought experiments. There are a bunch of different reasons for that. I just enumerated some of the positive reasons. People living in a like manner can understand each other, sympathize well with each other, understand why they do some things that may be seen as unpleasant or problematic or strange, or something to another region, but make perfect sense in your region. So those are the positive reasons, right? We're like each other, we're kindred, we're related, and another positive, there's another really important positive reason, which is, if I live in a way that damages my immediate environment, right? The people who would be impacted by that damage ought to have a relationship with me that helps me to constrain my behavior to what's good for us, and encourages me to engage in activities and behavior that promote the common welfare. If I do something, just as an example, if I salted my backyard so nothing would grow there, probably it would leach into my neighbors' yards and affect them significantly. And probably somebody in Alaska wouldn't care, or Burma, or whatever. I don't know. Myanmar? Whatever. I just picked a random name out of my mind. So it would have very little impact. Giving the people who aren't impacted a lot of say is not as good as giving the people who are impacted. Okay, there's also one really big related negative correlation to human prosperity, which is back to our first law of polity: people pervert everything. It is much easier to exploit the person that you don't ever have to look at than the person that you do. If you give somebody in, a place, a land, a city, 1,000 miles away, the ability to exploit your labor, tax you, whatever, for whatever their purposes are, they won't care. They'll do it. They will. This is Montaigne, right? They'll vote themselves largesse out of the purse of others. Having smaller county-sized states like this will prevent, it'll be an inhibitor, making it more difficult to pervert this particular aspect of governance, which is the control over how other people live. We'll talk about next time or sometime soon the other side of that, which is, what do you do when I live in a state, just as an example, that is very much against slavery, right? This is a thing that happened in the United States and in many countries. I live in a state that's very much against slavery, but those people live in a state that is very much for slavery. They have slaves, that kind of thing. And how do you resolve that kind of conflict if you're optimizing for different places to have the freedom to live in this, ways that they want? That is not what we're optimizing for. We're optimizing for human flourishing. So we'll talk about this more at a different time, but the goal is not to make it so that people can live however they want. The goal is to build a set of norms and laws and culture that makes it harder to do the things that minimize human flourishing and easier to do the things that maximize human flourishing for oneself and others. Okay, so next time we have a couple of topics to talk about: how we got our state sizes. I also want to talk about, I want to take an actual look at beginning some articles, some constitutional articles. I will show you a tool that I've been working on that is for how to build a constitution and then iteratively progress it towards something final with input from other people. It'll have requests for comments. People will be able to eventually log in, leave comments, leave suggestions, leave recommendations for what they think is a good way to do it. They'll be voting on things, help us to do things, and we'll move towards a stable constitution that accomplishes the ends we hope to accomplish. And then, just to remind you, I'll try to do it every episode, this is not a purely theoretical exercise. This is actually working towards creating a country. Let's make a country. Thanks for watching. I'm looking forward to talking with you in future episodes. I'm also looking forward to getting better at this. I bet once I have done 400 hours of this video, I'll stop saying so much and stop touching my face constantly and all kinds of things like that. And hopefully we will make good progress towards where we're going and make this thing happen. So thanks. I hope you have a great night or day or whatever time you're watching this. And let's make a country.